This is a long-standing project and something I committed to before the election, and therefore it's delivering on that promise, and it's consistent with what we did in the spring statement just the other day, which is in a period where the world seems more uncertain and more unstable. It's really important that we have economic stability in this country. This is really important. It's a big boost, £415 million on top of the other investment, which will mean better trains, Transpennine in particular, for the region. This is a huge region, many millions of people, huge ambition, brilliant businesses, and the transport system needs to match the ambition of the communities, and that's what we're doing today.
I want to talk to you about the spring statement. We haven't really had a chance to talk to you since then, since the impact assessment showed that...
When Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, arrived in Paris, he had an important task on his shoulders to demonstrate his political strength and strategic thinking at a difficult and tense moment for the world community. However, instead of strengthening his position in the international arena, his words became a real political disaster, causing a storm of indignation both inside and outside the country. The plans, which were supposed to be a demonstration of determination and coherence, turned into political suicide, turning his speech into a real political failure. It was not his meeting with world leaders that was at the center of the scandal, but a completely unexpected statement made during this diplomatic visit. Starmer, under pressure from both internal and external challenges, announced that the decision on the possible deployment of British troops in Ukraine, if necessary, would be discussed by Parliament, but only if it was related to a long-term military mission. This seemingly logical and cautious statement instantly attracted attention, but not in the way the Prime Minister had hoped. Instead of reassuring society and demonstrating political maturity, Starmer led the country into a political crisis, almost destroying his own positions.
250,000 people could be pushed into poverty. I guess, on a human level, not just a political level, that must be a difficult thing, a difficult consequence.
Well, starting with that human level, my own family has been impacted by disability all my life. My late mother was extremely ill all of her life, and my late brother, who lived in Yorkshire, was very ill and disabled, particularly when he got cancer, which he died of. So I do understand that human level. But we're addressing something which is a system which isn't working. We've got 1 million young people, 1 in 8, who are neither learning nor earning, who are going effectively from school onto some sort of benefit. Now, some of them will need that support. I don't deny that for a moment. But it can't be right that this growing number of young people, when all the evidence shows that if you're going essentially from school to some sort of benefit, then you're not likely to have the chance to get a job that's going to be secure and well paid for the rest of your life. That cannot be right.
The very fact that the issue of deploying troops was brought up for discussion by Parliament only in the case of a long-term mission has become a stumbling block. These words immediately provoked a flurry of criticism, not only from the opposition but also from within Starmer's party itself. For many of his opponents, this move was further proof that he is unable to effectively manage a difficult situation, risking involving Britain in an international conflict without proper oversight and transparency. Instead of explaining clearly how the decision-making would take place, the Prime Minister outlined an uncertain picture in which Parliament would probably get the floor only after the situation got out of control. This element of uncertainty has generated not only discontent, but also growing fears that the country could be dragged into deeper military commitments without proper coordination with its democratic institutions. Many political analysts immediately noticed the threat hidden in these words. Starmer's statement about the possible long-term deployment of British troops in Ukraine looked like an inconsistent and dangerous move. How can we talk about a long-term mission when the very idea of peace in Ukraine, in fact, remained uncertain? This did not seem to be a preparation for a decision, but rather a step towards military escalation, for which the UK might not be ready. The Prime Minister's uncertainty concerned not only the very content of a possible military operation, but also when and how Parliament would be involved in a decision of this magnitude. For many, this was an alarming signal, indicating that Starmer was not in control of the situation, but on the contrary, he was becoming its hostage. What exactly caused such a storm in the political sphere? Starmer not only did not give a clear answer to the questions of public concern, but also left room for a wide variety of interpretations of his words. Why shouldn't Parliament be involved in the discussion of this issue at an early stage? Why does parliamentary control become secondary in a situation where Britain may be on the verge of military action? These questions remained unanswered, and they became the source of growing discontent and bewilderment. Opposition leaders immediately took advantage of this moment to criticize the Prime Minister, saying that his words undermined the foundations of the democratic process, which should have included parliamentary approval of any military operations from the very beginning. But not only the opposition reacted to his statement, there was also a storm of discontent within the Labour Party itself. Some of its members began openly expressing doubts about Starmer's political maturity. Many of them feared that his indecision and lack of a clear plan could lead to Britain being drawn into an international conflict without a proper mandate and coordination with the people. These high-level debates soon took on dangerous proportions, and more politicians began to express concern that Britain could find itself at the center of an international military escalation without proper oversight. But the most striking moment that finally turned these reflections into a political crisis was Starmer's statement that Parliament would discuss the issue of deploying troops only in the case of a long-term mission. This not only gave the impression that the country could be dragged into an international conflict without proper discussion, but also highlighted the political irresponsibility of the Prime Minister at a time when he should have been as transparent and ready to make decisions that concern the security of the entire nation. The political reaction was immediate. Leaders of other parties began openly accusing Starmer of trying to avoid parliamentary control, and his statement became a serious reason to doubt that the country was on the right track. Instead of building trust in his party and his government, Starmer found himself at the center of a scandal that became a real political nightmare. His words, which could have been an example of political maturity, turned into a decisive step towards a political crisis. Now, many were beginning to doubt his ability to take responsibility in the face of international instability, and even those who had previously supported him began to express concerns that his political position was not clear and decisive enough. The question of whether Britain will take part in the conflict in Ukraine has become not only a geopolitical issue, but also a political risk for Starmer himself. The situation surrounding British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's remarks continued to develop at an alarming rate as soon as it became known that British military leaders would be sent to Ukraine as part of a joint operation with their French and German counterparts. Starmer, trying to explain these actions as steps towards ensuring peace, faced a wave of discontent and concern, not only in the UK but also on the international stage. The expectations from his government were simple and unambiguous: the peacekeeping initiative should be transparent and act with a clear goal and not become a pretext for deeper military escalation. But instead, his statement only raised more questions about the real nature of Britain's future military presence in Ukraine. Starmer said that Britain would work closely with major European powers to develop plans to ensure peace and security in Ukraine, but did not specify what exactly was meant by such operations. As a result, the word peacemaking, which sounded so convincing in his statements, turned out to be an empty promise against the background of geopolitical reality. Military experts and political observers immediately began to point out that this could be nothing more than preparations for a much larger military operation, which does not have a clear legal basis, and more importantly, parliamentary approval. Instead of ensuring peace, the actions of Britain and other major European countries risked leading to further escalation and involvement in a conflict that was becoming more dangerous and unpredictable every day. After Starmer's statement, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky accused Russia of violating the terms of the truce and attacking key energy facilities in Ukraine, which further increased concern about the real situation in the country. Zelensky publicly called on the United States to respond immediately to Moscow's violations, but the world seemed to be moving towards a new phase of conflict. In this situation, the issue of deploying British troops, albeit for the purpose of peacemaking, became increasingly complex and required a thorough assessment of all risks. Against the background of growing threats from Russia and uncertainty about the truce, Starmer's statement about preparations for a peacekeeping mission looked extremely unconvincing. If even a temporary truce cannot be maintained in Ukraine, then what is the point of planning a long-term mission without clear guarantees of stability? The problem is that while the very idea of peace looks extremely illusory, questions about Britain's real role in this process remain unanswered. The Prime Minister's statement that the British military would have to work in Ukraine with the French and Germans to operationalize the peace agreement raised many questions from experts. If the peace process in Ukraine, as before, remains under threat, then why is the UK rushing to deploy its troops, especially without clear parliamentary approval? Is this really a step towards peace, or can it be seen as an escalation that raises the stakes in an even more uncertain and dangerous situation? When Starmer said that the British military would work with its allies to develop operational plans, his words sounded like an attempt to emphasize a diplomatic initiative, but provoked a backlash. What if this step led to an expansion of the British military presence in Ukraine? The presence of British military consultants, if it is not clearly limited to consultations and peacekeeping assistance, may be the first step towards a more direct military intervention, which in turn will raise the issue of support for such actions by the British Parliament. At that moment, Ukraine became the epicenter of international attention, and every step taken by Britain and other world powers began to be closely monitored. British political analysts have begun asking important questions. What if the very idea of a peacekeeping mission turns out to be nothing more than a cover for a more aggressive stance towards Russia? Against the background of statements about the need to operationalize the peace process, it became obvious that the UK in fact could find itself in a position where it would exert significant military influence on Ukraine, despite the lack of a clear political mandate for this. The old threat, which had remained in the shadows until that time, soon became relevant. What if, as the conflict escalated, Britain became embroiled in an international conflict without proper parliamentary oversight? Each new statement from Starmer only increased this danger. It is noteworthy that the decision to deploy troops was placed in the category of uncertainty, which in turn left Britain on the verge of possible involvement in an international conflict without a proper legal basis. Instead of ensuring stability, Starmer was accused of setting a dangerous precedent that risks jeopardizing not only international security, but also domestic political stability. The responsibility for military action should lie with Parliament, but instead the Prime Minister tried to carefully circumvent this issue, leaving the way open for a possible escalation of military activity without approval at the highest level. As a result, in light of the current situation, Starmer found himself under severe pressure. His words that we will be ready to promptly implement a peace agreement when its exact form is determined were perceived as a bold but unconvincing position. Against the backdrop of escalating hostilities, this statement did not look like a step towards peace, but as another stage of military escalation that could change the political situation in the UK. Unfortunately, peace continued to be an increasingly distant goal, and questions about Britain's real role in the Ukrainian conflict became more acute. After British Prime Minister Keir Starmer found himself at the center of a political scandal over his statement about the possible deployment of British troops in Ukraine, his situation became increasingly critical. Despite promises that Parliament would be involved in deciding on a long-term military mission, the uncertainty with which it approached the issue not only put it in an awkward position, but also caused a storm of indignation both inside and outside the country. After British Prime Minister Keir Starmer found himself at the center of a political scandal over his statement about the possible deployment of British troops in Ukraine, his situation became increasingly critical. Despite promises that Parliament would be involved in deciding on a long-term military mission, the uncertainty with which it approached the issue not only put it in an awkward position, but also caused a storm of indignation both inside and outside the country. Starmer found himself under pressure with every new remark, as his words, against the backdrop of a growing threat of escalation, cast doubt not only on his political maturity, but also on his ability to lead in times of geopolitical instability. Starmer's opponents began actively using his statement to launch accusations against him that his actions could endanger not only domestic political stability, but also national security. More importantly, they have exacerbated issues related to the democratic. Starmer's opponents began actively using his statement to accusations against him that his actions could endanger not only domestic political stability, but also national security. More importantly, they have exacerbated issues related to the democratic control that Parliament should exercise over military operations. Starmer, instead of making a clear and unambiguous promise that Parliament would control every stage of a possible military intervention, allowed himself to leave too much uncertainty. This worked in his favor only if the goal was to maintain external political flexibility, but within the framework of domestic policy, this exacerbated a crisis of trust that was not easily resolved. Every day the discontent grew. An increasing number of politicians and analysts began to accuse him of lacking a clear position on one of the most important issues of national security. For many, the decision to deploy troops in Ukraine could have been not only an episode related to military strategy, but also a harbinger of Britain's larger involve. Every day, the discontent grew. An increasing number of politicians and analysts began to accuse him of lacking a clear position on one of the most important issues of national security. For many, the decision to deploy troops in Ukraine could have been not only an episode related to military strategy, but also a harbinger of Britain's larger involvement in the conflict, from which it could hardly have emerged without losses. The situation in Ukraine continued to be extremely unstable, and the prospects for a peace process seemed increasingly dim. Meanwhile, Starmer's words, in which he assured the public that the British military would be involved in a peacekeeping operation, did not look like steps towards peace, but rather like another escalation of military escalation. But the biggest concern was the fact that Starmer refused to give a direct and clear commitment that the UK Parliament would have a primary role in making the decision. His evasiveness raised questions not only from political opponents but also from part of his own party. Many of them but the biggest concern was the fact that Starmer refused to give a direct and clear commitment that the UK Parliament would have a primary role in making the decision. His evasiveness raised questions not only from political opponents but also from part of his own party. Many of them doubted that he was capable of taking responsibility for such serious political steps. Unlike other politicians, Starmer did not propose a clear procedure for how Parliament should participate in deciding on the deployment of troops. This moment has become one of the main topics of discussion in the British media. Instead of strengthening his party's position, he himself found himself at the center of a heated political discussion that brought nothing but doubt and confusion. Meanwhile, the political scene continued to rage. Leaders of other parties, such as Rishi Sunak and Liberal Democrat politicians, began openly condemning Starmer's policies. Sunak noted that the situation is so serious that participation in possible military operations. Meanwhile, the political scene continued to rage. Other parties, such as Rishi Sunak and Liberal Democrat politicians, began openly condemning Starmer's policies. Sunak noted that the situation is so serious that participation in possible military operations should be discussed immediately and not postponed indefinitely. The leaders of the reformist parties joined these accusations, saying that Britain risked being drawn into long-term military commitments without having full legitimacy for such actions. As Starmer continued to insist that Parliament would only get the floor if troops were deployed on a long-term basis, but this position did not remove the threat to his political reputation. Meanwhile, the international situation continued to deepen. Ukraine, despite attempts at peace talks, continued to suffer from attacks and violations of the truce. Every day it became more and more obvious that the peacekeeping initiative, if it was conceived, required much more serious efforts than just promises. Starmer's claims that meanwhile the international situation continued to deepen. Ukraine, despite attempts at peace talks, continued to suffer from attacks and violations of the truce. Every day it became more and more obvious that the peacekeeping initiative, if it was conceived, required much more serious efforts than just promises. Starmer's claims that the British military could be involved in peace operations amid the ongoing attacks sounded increasingly unconvincing. How can we talk about peacemaking if peace doesn't seem ready to come yet? For Starmer himself, the situation was becoming more and more alarming. He was caught between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, he needed to support an international strategy aimed at supporting Ukraine. On the other, to avoid involving Britain in an international conflict without proper parliamentary approval. But his attempts to find a balance between these two points of view only increased his political vulnerability. When the political storm around his words did not subside, it became clear that Starmer would need to reconsider his position. There were fears that his plans to deploy British troops could not only increase political tension inside the country, but also lead to further destabilization in Parliament itself. The question of whether Parliament will participate in the decision on military operations has become a key issue for the future political course. Starmer risked finding himself in a situation where his actions would be seen not as steps towards solving an international problem, but as a harbinger of deeper British intervention in military operations without the proper support of democratic institutions. Who will be right in this political game? Will public opinion and domestic pressure force Starmer to reconsider his course, or will the UK find itself embroiled in a deeper military escalation?